Discover a new, in-depth approach to book coverage with this extended summary. Unlike our previous review, which offers a focused analysis, this feature delivers a comprehensive overview tracing the intellectual roots, key arguments, and real-world impact of this subject. If you appreciate this expanded format and find it helpful, let us know. Your feedback will help shape future content.
It is definitely a bold way to frame our discussion today, but honestly, for this specific book, bold is really the only way to go.
It really is. But before we get into the heavy lifting, I want to try a little experiment with you. Stop whatever you are doing right now. Just look at your own hand.
Yeah, even just think about your eye.
Exactly. Consider the mechanical audacity of it. The lens focusing light, the retina capturing photons, the optic nerve firing millions of electrical impulses to a brain that interprets them as a seamless image. It is a masterpiece of engineering. And the idea that this just happened by accident, it feels statistically impossible.
Right. It feels like walking through a junkyard, finding a fully functioning Boeing 747, and assuming a tornado just blew through and assembled it by chance.
That is the exact intuition we are fighting against today. And frankly, it is a very strong intuition. You are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM for deeper, more dynamic book summaries.
And today, we are taking on the definitive defense of Darwinian evolution. We are unpacking the book, The Blind Watchmaker, Why the Evidence of Evolution Reveals a Universe Without Design by Richard Dawkins.
Published originally in 1986 and updated in 1996.
Yes. This book is effectively the battering ram the author used to break down the argument from design.
So our mission today is to truly unpack his central thesis. The idea that the staggering complexity of the natural world, which looks so incredibly designed, is actually the result of natural selection, a process with no mind, no foresight, and absolutely no plan.
And just to be completely clear from the outset, we are simply discussing the content and arguments presented in the book. We were not conducting original research or offering our own theological rebuttals.
Right. All the points we raise are paraphrased directly from the author's work for educational purposes.
Yeah.
We are just here to understand why he believes biology is the study of complex things that appear to have been designed for a purpose.
That appearance of design is exactly where the author starts in Chapter 1. He doesn't dismiss it. He actually leans right into it.
He spends a lot of time talking about bats. And I have to say, I thought I understood echolocation, but the way the book describes the engineering involved, it is basically military-grade stuff.
Well, as the author points out, it is far superior to military grade. He highlights that bats are not just shouting and listening for a simple echo. They are using frequency-modulated sweeps.
FM sweeps, like a radio station.
In a way, yes. A bat might start a shriek at a very high pitch and sweep it down to a low pitch. This allows them to distinguish the actual texture of the target, not just how far away it is.
That is why.
But the real engineering marvel, he notes, is the send-receive problem. Think about it. If a bat shouts loud enough to hear an echo bounce off a tiny moth 50 yards away, that initial shout should deafen the bat instantly.
Right. It would be like setting off a siren right next to your own ear and then trying to hear a whisper a split second later.
Exactly. And the author explains the biological solution. Bats have these tiny muscles attached to the bones in their ears. They contract milliseconds before the bat screams.
So they physically disconnect their own hearing.
Yes. They disconnect the ear, scream, and then relax the muscle instantly to catch the returning echo. And they are doing this mechanical switching hundreds of times a second.
That is just incredible. And as the book points out, human engineers invented radar and sonar in World War II, and we thought we were absolute geniuses for figuring it out. Meanwhile, bats have been doing it with much higher fidelity for 50 million years.
And this is the trap we fall into. The engineering is so flawless that when we see it in a machine, we know there was a human designer. So when we see it in a mammal, our brain instinctively screams that there must be a designer too.
Which brings us perfectly to the most famous foil in the book, the 18th century theologian William Paley. Chapter 2 dives right into this.
The man with the watch. Paley's argument is the one that really sticks with people. He said, if you walk across a heath and hit your foot on a stone, you don't think much of it. You assume it has always been there. But if you find a watch...
You infer a watchmaker.
Precisely. Paley argued that the specific arrangement of gears and springs for a very clear purpose-telling time proves there was an intelligent agent involved. You cannot get a watch by random chance, so if you find an eye, you must assume a creator.
And the interesting thing is, the author actually has a lot of respect for Paley. He notes that Paley identified the problem perfectly. Complex adaptation demands a real explanation.
Paley just got the solution wrong. He thought the solution was God. The author argues the solution is natural selection, but he calls it a blind watchmaker.
Let's clarify that term because blind makes it sound completely random. And the book is very specific that this process is not random at all.
That is the most common misunderstanding. Natural selection is the exact opposite of random. It is a highly non-random filter, but it is blind in the sense that it doesn't look ahead.
Right.
A human watchmaker plans the watch. They visualize the finished product before they start. Natural selection has no plan. It doesn't care about next year, let alone a million years from now. It only cares about what works best right now in this exact moment.
But even hearing that, people still say, I just cannot see how an eye happens by itself. The author has a great term for this. He calls it the argument from personal incredulity.
Because it is a logical fallacy, saying I cannot imagine how an eye evolve. Well, that just tells us something about the limits of human imagination. It does not tell us about the limits of nature.
He doesn't just leave it there, though. He provides the mathematical antidote in Chapter 3. This is where we get to the core technical concept, single step versus cumulative selection.
This is crucial. Single-step selection is like the old monkeys on typewriters cliché.
Right. If you want a monkey to type a specific sentence by banging on keys at random.
The author uses a line from Shakespeare. Methinks it is like a weasel. If you try to get that purely by random chance all at once, the math is staggering. It is practically impossible.
The universe simply isn't old enough for that to work out. You have to get every single letter right in one try. That is single step.
But evolution uses cumulative selection. To demonstrate this, the author wrote a computer program. He starts with random gibberish. But in his version, the computer generates copies of the gibberish with tiny random errors mutations.
Okay.
Then the program selects the copy that is closest to the target phrase. Even if it just has one single letter in the right spot, it saves that progress.
It locks it in. It doesn't randomize the correct letters again.
Exactly. It preserves the tiny success and breeds the next generation from it. In the simulation, starting from total nonsense, it hits me thinks it is like a weasel in just over 40 generations. It takes seconds.
That is the key insight. The difference between never in a trillion years and a few seconds. That is the raw power of cumulative selection.
Mutation is random, but the selection of what survives is completely non-random. It completely changes the math. You aren't trying to jump to the top of Mount Everest in one single bound. You're just walking up a very gentle slope, step by tiny step.
And he took this even further with another program he wrote, the biomorphs.
Yes, this wasn't just text anymore. He wrote a program that generated tree-like shapes from 9 simple digital genes.
And he added a storytelling element in the book here that I found really compelling. He describes playing his own game and getting completely lost in the evolution of these shapes.
He was navigating what he calls animal space. He started with a simple dot and let it reproduce with mutations on his screen. He acted as the selector, just clicking on the shapes that look interesting to him.
And he ended up finding shapes that look like insects, scorpions, I think even a Spitfire airplane.
He did. But the profound realization came when he realized he couldn't find his way back. The mathematical combinations were so vast that once he evolved a complex shape, he couldn't retrace his steps to recreate it from scratch.
It really illustrates how vast the potential for life is. Simple rules create incredibly complex forms.
It does. But then, as he notes in Chapter 4, we hit the brick wall that critics always throw up, the evolution of the eye.
The classic objection. What use is half an eye?
The author dismantles this so beautifully. The whole objection assumes that an eye is all or nothing, that it is either a perfect camera or it is totally useless. But he asks, is 1% vision useless?
Definitely not. If I am being chased by a predator, 1% vision is vastly better than total blindness.
Exactly. Even a completely flat, simple, light-sensitive spot on the skin lets an organism know if a shadow passes over it. That is crucial survival data.
And from there, the book describes this perfect, viable gradient.
If that flat patch of skin mutates and curves into a slight cup shape, suddenly you can tell the direction the light is coming from. That is a mass advantage.
And if you close the opening of that cup just a little bit, you start getting a pinhole camera effect. It's a blurry image, sure, but it is an actual image.
Then you add a transparent layer over the hole for protection. Over time, that layer thickens in the middle to become a lens for focus. At no single point in that chain do you need a miracle. Every step offers a tangible, viable advantage over the previous model.
In fact, the book points out something called convergent evolution. The eye is such a good solution to a basic physics problem that it has evolved independently in many different lineages. dozens of times.
This is not a fluke at all.
But to build an eye, you need a blueprint. And this transitions us nicely into Chapter 5, where he discusses DNA as information.
He compares DNA directly to digital ROM read-only memory, which was a very forward-thinking analogy in the 80s.
It really highlights the precision of the system. The text notes that DNA preserves records with roughly only a 1% error rate over 5 million generations.
The fidelity has to be that high. If the error rate were too high, evolution would completely fall apart because you couldn't hold on to the advantageous traits. But you still need those rare, tiny errors to provide the raw material for selection.
He also explains a crucial fix to Darwin's original theory here: particulate inheritance.
Yes. In Darwin's time, people thought inheritance worked like blending paint. If you mix red and white, you get pink. But the problem with blending is that eventually everything just becomes a uniform, bland beige. You lose the variation.
Right, the traits would just wash out.
But the author explains that genes don't blend like paint. They are discrete units. They act more like shuffling a deck of cards. A king of hearts stays a king of hearts no matter how many times you shuffle the deck.
So a rare advantageous trait can survive, maybe hide for a generation or two, and then reemerge completely intact.
Before we go further, we want to mention Mindful Moments, our YouTube channel offering AI, book analysis, summaries, and critiques, inspiring reflection and rational thought, and valuable for aspiring authors.
It is a phenomenal resource if you want to keep exploring these deep concepts. Now, moving into Chapter 6, the book makes a very important distinction. We have talked a lot about how life changes, but what about how it actually started?
Right, the origin of life. The author separates evolution, which is how life changes, from abiogenesis, which is how life started from non-living matter.
And he introduces his concept of a miracle here, which I found fascinating because he completely strips the magic out of the word.
He argues that miracles are just extremely improbable events. If the odds of life starting spontaneously are 1 in a billion per year, well, on a short human timescale, we would call that impossible, a miracle.
But if you give it billions of planets and billions of years, the improbable eventually becomes a statistical inevitability. It is bound to happen somewhere.
We just happen to be sitting on the planet where it did happen.
Yeah.
He also mentions the clay theory in the book.
Yes, the idea that the precursor to organic DNA might have been self-replicating inorganic crystals in river clay.
It is a possible scaffold for life. But his main point is simply that once that very first replicator exists, once you have anything that copies itself with slight errors, the blind watchmaker wakes up and starts building.
And nature isn't just weeding out the weak. Chapter 7 explains that evolution is constructive.
It builds things up through the arms race. Evolution is a competition. A cheetah evolves to run faster, not because the physical ground is changing, but because the gazelle is evolving to run faster.
And the gazelle gets more agile because the cheetah is getting faster. They are co-evolving.
They push each other constantly. This creates the powerful illusion of progress or better engineering over time, when really it's just an endless cycle of one-upmanship.
But then we get to Chapter 8, and we look at things that seem to make no survival sense at all. The peacock.
Explosions and spirals, as he calls them.
Right. Why would a bird evolve a massive, heavy, highly visible tail that makes it incredibly easy for a predator to catch?
This brings us to sexual selection. It is a completely different kind of pressure. The author explains the runaway feedback loop based on Fisher and Landay's models.
How does that loop start?
It can start arbitrarily. If females in a population develop a preference for a certain trait, say a slightly longer tail, then males with longer tails get more mates.
So the males pass on the gene for long tails to their sons.
And crucially, they pass on the gene for preferring long tails to their daughters. It becomes a self-reinforcing spiral. The preference and the trait evolve together until it reaches an extreme.
He cites the Malta-Anderson experiment with widow birds to prove this, right?
Yes, it is a brilliant experiment. Anderson took male widow birds, which naturally have long tails, and physically cut some of their tails short. Then he took those cut feathers and glued them onto other males to create super long, unnatural tails.
He basically gave them feather extensions.
He did. And the result was that the females overwhelmingly chose the males with the glued-on super tails. It demonstrated that female preference is often open-ended. They just want more of the trait, pushing the evolution until the actual physical cost of survival finally stops it.
As we get into Chapters 9, 10, and 11, the author takes the time to address some clarifications and rival theories, starting with the controversy over punctuated equilibrium.
This was a major debate with scientists like Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge. They looked at the fossil record and saw long periods of stasis, no change, interrupted by sudden jumps where new forms appeared quickly.
Which seems to contradict Darwin's idea of constant, slow, gradual change.
It does seem that way, but the author clarifies his stance very firmly. He argues that evolution isn't always moving at a perfectly constant speed, sure. But those jumps in the fossil record are usually just illusions.
Illusions comes by what?
Often it is just a case of a new species migrating into a new area or just inconsistent fossil preservation. He argues it is absolutely not a different mechanism than Darwinism. Gradual natural selection is still the only engine.
He also briefly touches on the molecular clock in Chapter 10.
Yes, how DNA sequencing allows us to look at the differences between species and build the one true objective family tree of all living things.
And then Chapter 11 is the final dismantling of the doomed rivals to his theory.
He takes on Lamarckism first, the idea that you can inherit acquired traits, like a giraffe stretching its neck and passing a longer neck to its baby.
He dismisses that entirely.
Because we know how DNA works now. Changes to your physical body during your life do not rewrite the digital code in your DNA. So Lamarckism fails.
He also dismisses creationism.
He dismisses it fundamentally because it lacks explanatory power. If you say a complex eye was designed by a creator, you now have to explain the creator. You have just pushed the problem of complexity back one step without actually solving it.
Which leads us to the final synthesis of the book, the impact of the blind watchmaker argument. He makes a very famous statement in the conclusion.
He states that Darwinism is what allows one to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist.
It is a profound sentiment. Before Darwin, if you saw the complexity of nature, you really couldn't explain it without a designer.
But the blind watchmaker concept explains the illusion of design entirely through natural, unguided laws. We are the result of cumulative selection acting over vast oceans of time.
It is incredibly humbling. We are the survivors of a 4 billion-year process of pure survival. But I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over, something that builds on everything we have discussed today.
The author spent the entire book proving that the watchmaker is blind. It has no vision, no plan, no purpose.
Right. But that blind, unthinking process eventually built us. And we are not blind. We actually have foresight. We can make plans. We can look at our environment and choose what to do next.
The blind process managed to create the one thing capable of truly seeing.
Exactly. We are the universe's way of opening its eyes. And that gives us a completely different kind of responsibility moving forward.
It is a fascinating paradox to end on.
Click the link on screen for the in-depth book critique, subscribe, share, purchase via link, and think rationally.
Question the illusion of design and marvel at the reality of the process.
See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.